On that cold morning in June, the waves of the English Channel crashed against the metallic hull of the landing craft. Private James Morrison, from the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Infantry Division, was a 22-year-old American soldier. He gripped his M1 Garand rifle tightly, but his trembling hands seemed glued to the cold metal of the weapon. Around him were hundreds of soldiers. Some were praying silently, others clutching photographs of their families. But no one was talking. The only sounds were the roar of the engine, the splash of water, and the distant thunder of artillery fire that grew closer with each passing second. James had never been in combat before. He had trained for months at Camp Blanding in Florida, run through obstacle courses, fired thousands of rounds at paper targets, and memorized every battlefield drill. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for this moment. The smell of salt water mixed with diesel fuel and vomit filled his nostrils. Several men around him had already emptied their stomachs over the side of the craft. Fear was a living thing in that boat, crawling over every man's skin like invisible insects. The officer at the front of the landing craft, Lieutenant Harrison, was a tall man with a sharp jaw and eyes that had seen too much too soon. He stood near the front ramp, one hand gripping the metal bar above his head, the other resting on his pistol. He looked back at his men and tried to offer an encouraging nod, but his face was pale. Even the officers were terrified. They all knew what was waiting for them on that beach. James thought about his mother back in Virginia. He thought about the last letter he had written to her 3 days ago, the one where he promised he would come home safe. He thought about his younger sister, Emily, who had cried when he left for training. He thought about the girl he had danced with at the county fair 2 summers ago, whose name he could barely remember now, but whose smile still flickered in his memory like a distant light. All of these thoughts crashed through his mind in fragmented pieces, competing with the deafening roar of shells exploding somewhere ahead. The landing craft lurched violently to the left, and several men stumbled. Someone cursed. Another man sobbed quietly. The Navy coxswain steering the boat shouted something that was lost in the chaos of noise. They were getting close now. Very close. James could see smoke rising in thick black columns ahead, could hear the distinctive crack of rifle fire mixing with the heavier boom of German 80mm guns. The entire horizon seemed to be on fire. Lieutenant Harrison raised his hand and shouted over the noise. 30 seconds! Check your gear. Stay low when the ramp drops. Move fast and don't stop. Don't stop for anything. His voice was hoarse, almost breaking. The men around James began checking their equipment one last time. Helmets were tightened. Rifle slings were adjusted. Ammunition pouches were patted down. James did the same, his fingers moving mechanically, even as his mind struggled to process what was about to happen. The landing craft shuddered as it ground against the sand. This was it. The ramp was about to drop. James felt his heart hammering in his chest so hard he thought it might explode. His breathing came in short, rapid gasps. Time seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. He could see everything with crystalline clarity. The water pooling at his feet, the white knuckles of the man next to him gripping his rifle, the muscle twitching in Lieutenant Harrison's jaw. Then the ramp dropped. What happened next would be burned into James Morrison's memory for the rest of his life. The instant the ramp hit the water, a hail of machine gun fire tore into the landing craft. The distinctive sound of German MG-42 machine guns, which the American soldiers grimly called Hitler's buzzsaw because of their terrifying rate of fire, filled the air. The first 3 men off the ramp were cut down immediately. They dropped into the water without even a chance to scream. Blood bloomed in the surf, turning the gray-green water pink and red. "Off the ramp! Move! Move! Move!" Lieutenant Harrison was screaming now, but his voice was barely audible over the gunfire. Men began pouring off the sides of the landing craft, jumping into water that was chest-deep and brutally cold. James threw himself over the side, clutching his rifle above his head. The weight of his gear, his rifle, ammunition, grenades, entrenching tool, rations, and the waterproof bag containing extra socks pulled him down. The water closed over his helmet for a moment, and he panicked, thrashing upward until his head broke the surface. All around him was chaos beyond description. Landing craft were burning, bodies floated in the surf, men were screaming. The air was filled with the whistle of bullets, the crack of rifle fire, the boom of explosions, and the terrible screams of wounded and dying soldiers. The beach ahead was a nightmare landscape of obstacles, wooden stakes driven into the sand, metal barriers designed to rip apart landing craft, and coils of barbed wire. Beyond that was a stretch of sand, perhaps 200 yards deep, and beyond that were the bluffs, high cliff faces where German soldiers had dug in with machine gun nests, mortar positions, and artillery emplacements. It was a killing field by design. James tried to move forward, but the water resisted every step. It felt like walking through concrete. Bullets zipped through the water around him, leaving trails of bubbles. A soldier to his left suddenly threw up his arms and fell backward, his helmet flying off. Another man just ahead stumbled and went face down in the surf, and the water around him turned red. James kept moving. He had to keep moving. Lieutenant Harrison's words echoed in his head. "Don't stop for anything." He reached the edge of the water and threw himself down on the wet sand. Immediately, he realized his mistake. There was no cover here. The beach was wide open. German gunners on the bluffs above had perfect fields of fire across every inch of sand. Men who stopped moving became targets. Men who stayed still became corpses. James saw a group of soldiers trying to hide behind a knocked-out Sherman tank that had somehow made it to the beach. As he watched, a mortar round landed directly on them. When the smoke cleared, none of them were moving. A sergeant James didn't recognize ran past, screaming at men to get up and move forward. "You're gonna die if you stay here. Get to the seawall! Move your asses!" The seawall was a low concrete barrier about 50 yards ahead, at the base of the bluffs. It offered the only real cover on the entire beach. But getting there meant crossing open sand, while German machine gunners swept the beach with overlapping fields of fire. James forced himself to his feet and ran. He had never run so fast in his life. His legs pumped frantically, his boots slipping in the wet sand. Tracers zipped past his head. He heard bullets snapping through the air around him like angry hornets. Men were falling everywhere. A soldier to his right simply collapsed mid-stride, as if someone had cut his strings. Another man was hit in the leg and fell, screaming and clutching his thigh. James wanted to stop and help him, but he couldn't. He couldn't stop. If he stopped, he would die. Halfway to the seawall, James tripped over something and went sprawling. He landed hard on his stomach, the wind knocked out of him. For a moment he just lay there, gasping, tasting sand and blood in his mouth. He had bitten his tongue when he fell. Then he realized what he had tripped over. It was a body, a young soldier, maybe 19 years old, with half his face blown away. James scrambled backward, horrified, and then forced himself forward again. He grabbed his rifle, which he had dropped when he fell, and continued toward the seawall. He made it. Somehow, impossibly, he made it. James threw himself against the concrete barrier and pressed his back against it, chest heaving, gasping for air. Around him were dozens of other soldiers who had also reached this temporary sanctuary. Some were wounded. Most were terrified. A few were trying to return fire at the German positions above, but it was nearly impossible to acquire targets. The Germans were dug in too well, their positions camouflaged and reinforced with concrete bunkers. Lieutenant Harrison was there too, crouched behind the seawall with blood running down his left arm. He had been hit, but didn't seem to notice. He was shouting orders, trying to organize the survivors. "We need to take out those machine gun nests. Engineers, where are my engineers? We need Bangalore torpedoes to blow the wire. Medic, we need a medic over here." James looked back at the beach behind him. It was covered with bodies, hundreds of them. Men were still coming ashore, still trying to cross that deadly stretch of sand, and they were still dying. Landing craft continued to deposit troops into the water, and those troops continued to fall. The water's edge was thick with corpses bobbing in the surf. Equipment floated everywhere. Helmets, rifles, backpacks, ration boxes. Some landing craft had been hit and were burning, black smoke pouring from their hulls. The scene looked like something from hell itself. A young private next to James was sobbing uncontrollably, his rifle forgotten in the sand beside him. Another soldier was praying in rapid Spanish, his rosary beads clutched in white-knuckled fists. A third man was laughing, actually laughing, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that was worse than screaming. Combat had broken him already. James checked himself for wounds and was amazed to find he hadn't been hit. His uniform was soaked with seawater and blood, but none of the blood was his. He had made it across Omaha Beach without a scratch. He didn't know whether to feel grateful or guilty. So many men hadn't been as lucky. So many were dead or dying. Lieutenant Harrison grabbed James by the shoulder. "Morrison, you still functional?" James nodded, not trusting his voice. "Good. I need you to listen carefully. We're pinned down here and we're getting slaughtered. Those machine gun nests up on the bluff have to be neutralized, or none of us are getting off this beach alive. Do you understand?" James nodded again. Harrison pointed to a narrow ravine that cut through the bluff face about 100 yards to their right. "See that draw? That's our way up, but it's covered by at least 2 machine gun positions. We need to take them out." James finally found his voice. "How, sir? We can't even see them clearly." Harrison's jaw tightened. "We're going to have to assault them directly. Get close enough to throw grenades or use satchel charges. It's the only way." He paused, his eyes scanning the group of terrified soldiers pressed against the Sioux wall. "I need volunteers." No one moved. No one spoke. Volunteering for an assault up that bluff was volunteering to die. Everyone knew it. The silence stretched out, broken only by the constant crack of gunfire and the screams of wounded men. Then James heard himself speaking. "I'll go, sir." He didn't know why he said it. The words just came out. Maybe it was training. Maybe it was a sense of duty. Maybe it was because he couldn't stand the thought of staying pinned down on this beach while more men died. Or maybe it was because he realized that if someone didn't do something, they were all going to die here anyway. Lieutenant Harrison looked at James with something like surprise and respect. "Good man, Morrison." He turned to the others. "Who else? I need at least 5 more." Slowly, reluctantly, hands went up. A corporal named Davies volunteered, then a private named Kowalski, then 3 more soldiers whose names James didn't know. 6 men total, including Lieutenant Harrison. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Harrison quickly outlined the plan. They would move along the seawall to the right, using what little cover the concrete barrier provided. When they reached the base of the ravine, they would split into 2 groups. One group would provide covering fire, while the other moved up the slope toward the German positions. Then they would switch. Leapfrog tactics, moving from cover to cover until they got close enough to attack the machine gun nests directly. It was a simple plan, and a desperate one. James checked his rifle again and made sure his grenades were accessible. He had 4 fragmentation grenades hooked to his webbing. 4 chances to kill the enemy before they killed him. He tried not to think about the fact that German machine gun nests typically held 4 to 6 soldiers, plus support personnel. He tried not to think about the thick concrete bunkers they were built into, or the overlapping fields of fire that made approaching them nearly impossible. "All right," Lieutenant Harrison said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "On my signal, stay low, move fast, and for God's sake, don't bunch up, spread out." He looked at each man in turn, making eye contact. "If we do this right, we can save a lot of lives today. Are you ready?" The men nodded, though James could see the terror in their eyes, terror that he knew must be mirrored in his own. Harrison raised his hand. "Move out!" They began moving along the seawall, crouching low, trying to use the concrete as cover. German gunners above must have spotted them because bullets immediately began chipping at the top of the barrier, sending fragments of concrete flying. James kept his head down and kept moving. The ravine was getting closer. 50 yards, 40, 30. Then a mortar round landed 10 feet behind them. The explosion was deafening. James was thrown forward by the blast, his ears ringing. He looked back and saw that one of the volunteers, a young private whose name he hadn't learned, was down. The man's leg was twisted at an unnatural angle and blood was pooling beneath him. A medic ran over, but James could tell from the medic's expression that there wasn't much hope. 5 men left. Now, they kept moving. 20 yards to the ravine. 10 yards. They reached it. The ravine was a natural cut in the bluff face, perhaps 15 feet wide, rising at a steep angle up toward the German positions. It offered some cover from direct fire, but it was still a death trap. German gunners could simply fire down into it from above. Lieutenant Harrison split them into two groups. He would lead the first group, himself, Corporal Davies, and Private Kowalski, up the right side of the ravine. James would lead the second group, himself and the two other soldiers, up the left side. "We move fast and we move hard," Harrison said. "When I fire, you move. When you fire, we move. Got it?" Everyone nodded. Harrison signaled, and his group broke cover and began moving up the ravine. Immediately, German fire erupted from above. The distinctive sound of the MG-42 filled the air, a ripping, tearing noise that could fire up to 200 rounds per minute. Bullets kicked up dirt and rock all around Harrison's group as they scrambled for cover behind a large boulder. Now it was James's turn. "Go, go, go," he shouted, and his group broke cover. James ran up the left side of the ravine, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Bullets snapped past his head. He dove behind a fallen tree trunk and immediately began firing up toward the German positions. He couldn't see the enemy soldiers, they were too well concealed, but he fired anyway, hoping to suppress them long enough for Lieutenant Harrison's group to advance. It worked. Harrison's group moved up another 20 yards and took cover behind a ridge of rock. Now they opened fire, and James's group advanced. Back and forth they went, leapfrogging up the ravine, each group covering the other's advance. It was working. They were making progress. The machine gun nest was getting closer. Then Corporal Davies was hit. James saw it happen. Davies stood up to fire, and a burst from the German machine gun caught him in the chest. He fell backward and tumbled down the slope, his body limp. Lieutenant Harrison didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He kept moving forward, and Kowalski followed. James and his two companions continued their advance. They were close now, very close. James could see the concrete bunker that housed the machine gun nest. It was built into the side of the bluff, with a narrow firing slit through which the barrel of the MG-42 protruded. Dark shapes moved behind the slit. German soldiers adjusting their weapon, reloading, searching for targets. Harrison reached a position about 30 feet from the bunker. He pulled a grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, and hurled it toward the firing slit. It was a good throw. The grenade sailed through the air and landed just in front of the bunker entrance, but before it could explode, a German soldier kicked it back out. It detonated on the slope below, harmlessly. "Damn it!" Harrison shouted. He pulled another grenade, but before he could throw it, machine gun fire erupted from a second position they hadn't seen, a camouflaged foxhole about 20 yards to the right of the main bunker. The bullets caught Private Kowalski and one of James's companions. Both men went down. 3 left. Just James, Lieutenant Harrison, and one other soldier, a quiet kid from Tennessee, whose name James thought was Perkins. 3 men against at least 2 German machine gun positions. The odds were impossible. But they had come too far to stop now. Too many men had died to get them this far. James made a decision. He looked at Perkins and Harrison. "Cover me," he said. Before either man could respond, James broke cover and sprinted toward the main bunker. It was the craziest, most suicidal thing he had ever done. Time seemed to slow down. He could see every detail with perfect clarity, the gray concrete of the bunker, the dark firing slit, the muzzle flashes as the German machine gun opened up on him. Bullets tore through the air all around him. One grazed his left shoulder, spinning him slightly, but he kept his balance and kept running. He reached the side of the bunker, the blind spot where the machine gun couldn't traverse far enough to hit him. He pressed his back against the concrete wall, gasping for breath. His shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him, but it wasn't serious. He pulled a grenade from his belt. This was it. One chance. Inside the bunker, he could hear German voices shouting. They knew he was there. They were trying to reposition their weapon or grab their sidearms. James didn't give them the chance. He pulled the pin on the grenade, counted to 2, and tossed it through the firing slit. The explosion inside the enclosed concrete space was catastrophic. The blast wave burst back out of the firing slit in a cloud of dust and smoke. The machine gun fell silent. James didn't wait to see the results. He immediately pulled another grenade and turned toward the secondary position, the camouflaged foxhole. He threw the grenade in a high arc. It landed directly in the foxhole and detonated. Screams erupted, then fell silent. Both German positions were neutralized. James collapsed against the bunker wall, his legs suddenly weak. He couldn't believe he was still alive. He looked down at his hands and saw they were shaking uncontrollably. Lieutenant Harrison and Perkins were running up the slope toward him. Harrison's face was a mixture of shock and admiration. "Morrison, you crazy son of a bitch," Harrison said, clapping James on his good shoulder. "You actually did it." He keyed his radio. "Command, this is Harrison. We've neutralized the machine gun positions at Draw Echo 3. We have a path up the bluff. Send reinforcements immediately." Within minutes, more American soldiers began pouring up the ravine. With the machine gun nests silenced, they could finally advance. Engineers brought Bangalore torpedoes and blew gaps in the barbed wire. More troops flooded through. Slowly, painfully, the Americans began to establish a foothold on the bluffs above Omaha Beach. James sat with his back against the bunker and watched the sun climb higher in the sky. The battle was far from over. Fighting would continue for hours more, and the casualties would mount into the thousands, but the tide had turned. The invasion would succeed. He thought about the young private who had been hit by the mortar, about Corporal Davies tumbling down the slope, about Kowalski and all the others who hadn't made it off the beach. He thought about the hundreds of bodies still lying in the surf. He thought about how close he had come to being one of them. Lieutenant Harrison sat down next to him. Neither man spoke for a long time. Finally, Harrison said quietly, "You know they're going to want to give you a medal for this." James shook his head. "I don't want a medal, sir. I just want to go home." "So do we all, Morrison. So do we all." As the day wore on and more American forces secured the beachhead, James Morrison remained on that bluff, staring out at the English Channel. He had survived the longest day, but he knew that the war was far from over and that many more impossible decisions awaited him in the days and weeks to come. For now, though, he was alive, and on a beach where thousands had died, that was something close to a miracle. The invasion of Normandy would ultimately succeed, opening a second front in Europe that would lead to the defeat of Nazi Germany 11 months later. But the cost was staggering. On Omaha Beach alone, American forces suffered over 2,000 casualties on June 6, 1944. The men who fought there displayed extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Private James Morrison was one of thousands of ordinary soldiers who, when confronted with an impossible situation, found within themselves the strength to do the extraordinary. Years later, when people would ask James Morrison about D-Day, about what it was like to storm Omaha Beach, he would struggle to find words. How could you explain what it felt like to wade through water filled with the bodies of your friends? How could you describe the sound of bullets cutting through the air inches from your head? How could you convey the weight of knowing that every step forward might be your last? In the end, he would usually just say, "We did what we had to do." And perhaps that was the truest answer of all. Because on that terrible beach, in that crucible of fire and death, men like James Morrison made choices not because they were heroes, but because someone had to. They advanced not because they weren't afraid, but because staying still meant certain death. They fought not because they loved war, but because they loved the men beside them and couldn't bear to let them down. The story of Omaha Beach is ultimately a story about ordinary people pushed to extraordinary limits. It's about split-second decisions made under unimaginable pressure. It's about the thin line between life and death, between courage and terror, between success and catastrophic failure. And it's about the price that was paid by men like James Morrison and thousands of others to purchase the freedom we too often take for granted. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were secured. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The liberation of Europe had begun. But for the men who fought there, who survived the horror of that longest day, the memories would never fade. They would carry Omaha Beach with them for the rest of their lives. In their dreams, in their nightmares, in the quiet moments when they remembered friends who never made it home. James Morrison was one of the lucky ones. He survived D-Day. He survived the Battle of Normandy. He survived the war and returned home to Virginia, where he married, raised a family, and lived a long, quiet life. But a part of him never left that beach. A part of him remained forever in that moment when he ran across open sand toward a concrete bunker, when he made the decision to move forward instead of stay still, when he chose action over paralysis. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Omaha Beach, that in our darkest moments, when everything seems impossible and the odds are insurmountable, we still have a choice. We can freeze in fear, or we can move forward. We can give up, or we can fight. We can accept defeat, or we can do what seems impossible. The men of Omaha Beach chose to fight, and because they did, the world was changed forever.